Oh my goodness, I am so excited to have Brittany Tullis here with me today. Welcome, Brittany.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
So you have your hands full. My goodness. So you're a professor there at St. Ambrose College. You're also a chair of modern languages, as well as interim director, I believe, of women's and gender studies. Gosh, a lot. You have a lot going on.
A lot of good stuff.
A lot of good stuff. So tell me, you started your journey with a BA in English and Spanish from Iowa. You went on to get your PhD in Hispanic literature, also at the University of Iowa. But yeah, tell me, like, gosh, give us your origin story, Brittany.
Okay, so I am like probably the most unlikely professor of Spanish and comic studies that ever was. I was really like English and women's studies as an undergraduate, and like I was definitely go to graduate school in English and be an English professor. I was failing out of Spanish. Not a great student my first couple years, but this is a good motivating story, I think, sometimes for my undergrads. Yeah, for me, it was like, I ended up doing study abroad for a semester to kind of get through the rest of my language requirement, and really fell in love with Spanish. And so then I came back and had to really think hard about what that meant. And I ended up going to graduate school in Spanish. And when I started my PhD program, I took a class with Santiago Vaquero Vasquez, who was teaching this, I think it was like a Gen X graduate seminar, and I read The Death of Speedy. And it was the first time, honestly, that I had ever read like anything approaching a long form comic. I like, would sort of read some of the strips in the newspapers and stuff like that, but I wasn't a comics reader before. And so, I think that for so many people in the field, they grow up reading comics and they're in love with comics, and then they find these sort of ways to like convince people to let them work on this. And I really discovered comics in graduate school. And I was just really fortunate that Dr. Ana Marino had just been hired there. And so, she and I started working together really closely and published an article together. And I at that point, it was really clear on the fact that I wanted to write a dissertation on comics and essentially really double down on being a LatinX American comic scholar. And I was just really fortunate that I had an advisor who absolutely encouraged me to do it, who wasn't like, write one chapter in your dissertation about comics, which is what a lot of people hear. She was like, do it, so it was great. It was a great start for me.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I'm actually seeing more and more of scholars of your generation, Brittany, that are that don't necessarily have that kind of fan, kind of comic fan kind of origin, but have come in really strong into the sort of building of comic studies, and also in a way because there's a generation of you guys coming in kind of without, in a way, the baggage. You're bringing all these really radically kind of fresh and new vital perspectives into the study of comics. I just love it.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, though, and there's so much work that needs to be done, and you're, of course, doing this with the LatinX, the hemispheric comics studies that you're doing, but it is interesting that we're still kind of like so US focused, or so European, and even in Europe, very kind of Franco-Belgian focused in our comics lens and our comics analyses. What about your work, and how do you see it fitting in with a kind of, well, gosh, comics is more than just the United States?
Right. And I'm really glad that as the field continues to expand, that there's so many more people that are working in these areas, right? Like, I think it used to be that there was, and I think that there still is a concentration to some extent of comic scholars that are in like English departments, for example, right? But increasingly, I see so many more that are in, world languages departments, or women and gender studies, or comp lit, or people that are based in these different sort of areas and that are doing more internationally focused work. It's really important, right? It's one of the things that as comic studies continues to grow, I'm really glad that we're growing in that particular direction.
Yeah, so necessary, and a kind of wake up call to some of the older scholars that, comics has been and is a really kind of vital planetary storytelling space, right? Really important. But you also kind of, you're carving new paths with your bringing together childhood studies with comic studies. Can you walk us through that part of your kind of intellectual profile, your research profile, and maybe some surprising discoveries that you had?
Yeah, so when I wrote a dissertation on representation of women and girls in Latinx American comics at the University of Iowa, and as such, I was delving really deep into comics like Mafalda and sort of tracing those genealogies and kind of looking at these patterns of influence and getting into childhood studies and representations of children and things like that. It was actually that it's always the things that you don't realize that are going to be the most exciting parts of it. This was one of the most rewarding parts of that research for me. I think I really fell in love with this comic and with all the work that surrounds it in the field as well. And so I wrote this chapter on Mafalda, which is written by Quino, is an Argentine comic artist. And I was giving a talk at the International Comic Arts Forum. This was before I was on their board. I think it was back in 2013 or something like that. And I met Mark Heimerman there, who was at the time very much interested in these intersections as well of childhood studies and comic studies. And he was doing some really cool work. And we talked after a panel and got to talking about some of this stuff. And the idea for editing this collection really came out of that. One of the things that I think that we were both really noticing as we were doing our own research surrounding these intersections was that there wasn't a lot of work out there that connected them, even though, there's long been this idea of children and comics sort of going together, which is kind of right and wrong at the same time, which is another sort of topic, I suppose. But, there also wasn't much of an international exploration of those intersections, right? And so what we became really interested in was trying to create the beginnings of an exploration of what representations of childhood in comics looked like on a more global scale, right? So understanding too that there's no way to do that in one volume adequately, right? So this is also very much something that we were thinking about as a beginning. But it was such a great way to explore that topic further and see all of the other really excellent work that was being done there. We were both really, really proud of that, the volume and all the work that came out of it.
Yeah, there's so much really rich research in this area, yours and others. And I love too this kind of diving in and seeing how even when there have been restrictions and even, very dire consequences by creating, subversive comics, dire by, prison or being disappeared, that the kind of comics aimed at sort of children were able, or some of them anyway, to kind of slip through a sort of subtextual subterfuge kind of messages, right? And yeah, I mean, really, really powerful place for that.
Yeah, it is interesting how many, if you look back through the history, particularly of Latin American comics, or even Spanish comics, really during the Franco years. I mean, there's so many there's so many comics that are like children's comics, right? That use allegory as this sort of mode of resistance. And yeah, I mean, for some comics artists, certainly the stakes were really high, but a lot of great work there.
Absolutely. So speaking of kind of, subtext or even overt text, can you walk us through this concept of textual mestizaje?
Yeah, so this is a term that I use to talk about Love and Rockets by the Hernandez brothers. And there's a number of reasons that I do so. So mestizaje is this idea of blending, right? And creating a new, in this case, product via hybridity and sort of blending, right? And so one thing that's certainly true about Love and Rockets is that this is a very hybrid text, right? There's all kinds of like merging and blending that's happening, beginning with authorship, as this is a text that was originally written by three brothers, right? But also in terms of genre, right? Like this is a really sort of like genre bending, starts out as one thing, ends up being entirely another, with kind of like blips of other genres in there along the way. But also just in terms of narrative spaces, right? And I think that this is where, for me, that particular term makes a lot of sense as you're looking at the sort of like trans-American kind of merging of, the North and South, right? So looking at textual spaces as well, set both in the United States, but then also somewhere south of the border, as they say. And then even merging language, right? So you have stories written by Jaime, for example, that are, that are supposed to be read in English as it's written, but then also Gilbert's stories, even though a non-Spanish speaker is reading them in English, we're supposed to understand via these sort of brackets within the text that it's written, that it's in Spanish, right? We're just like reading the Google translation or whatever of this. And so there's all these sort of textual border crossings that are just happening all the time within this text. And so I guess I think that this is one of the ways that we can think about this as sort of a borderlands text, right? That explores these two different facets of these brothers, of their work, of the American Southwest, of comics also, right? I mean, comics is sort of the ultimate hybrid borderlands text when you're looking at this merging of text and image. And, I think that one of the other things that's really important to me here is that oftentimes when we talk about the sort of blending of North and South, when we talk about these kinds of cultural mergings, there tends to be this way in which people trace influences from North to South, right? Looking at the sort of influence of US comics in Latin American comics, for example. And I think that it's also really important, and this is one of the main sort of points that I wanted to make in this article, is that it's also really important to trace the influences that run from South to North, right? Like North America is not free of like this influence, right? Like even though there's very much been a sort of cultural imperialist model, right, that's been discussed since the 70s. I mean, there's also really key influences coming out of Latin America and the South. And so I think that, and I sort of trace that looking at literary traditions here. So looking at things like magical realism, which gets talked about a lot with Gilbert's work, for example, but also tracing the more feminist, like fantastic in here, right? From Latin American writers like Bombal and Garro and Ferre. And so I think too, this is one thing that people talk about when they talk about Love and Rockets, but I think that in a trans-American sense, it also rings true that, it's more than the sum of just its parts. And so I know that a lot of people, there's all these trade paperbacks now, and people tend to read like Jaime's stuff on one side or Gilbert's stuff. And, they get read in these sort of separated ways. And I think that that's fine, it's enjoyable, whatever, but it's also, you don't get the full sort of importance of the work that they're doing here, and until you sit down and just look at it all together, right? And I think that the same can be said about US and Latin American or Latinx American culture too, right? Like we really can't consider one without the other. And so it's just important to keep in mind the ways in which all of this comes to bear on culture on both sides of the border, right?
Absolutely. And also, taking your concept and your work, of course, very importantly, allows us not only to kind of look from the South north, but to actually revise some of our sort of comics histories, like the alternative comics history, somehow, growing out of, Spiegelman or, Chris Ware or et cetera, and actually seeing how alternative comics in North America is very much an alternative comics grown or seeded by the Hernandez brothers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So important that you're doing this. Staying sort of south of the border in Mexico, you also work on Mafalda, and Mafalda. Actually, no, we're even farther south of the border. Sorry,
Yeah.
And the critique of gender roles. Can you talk about that in Quino? I know we just mentioned the kind of Aesopian subtextual stuff going on, but yeah, maybe can you walk us through this?
Yeah, so this is I love this strip so much, and so this is a strip that was published in newspapers in Buenos Aires and then throughout Argentina from 1964 to 1973. And it's actually interesting because it began. Quino was started drawing this strip because he was trying to make some money selling advertisements. And so initially, like Mafalda and her family were created as a means of selling like household appliances like stoves and dishwashers and stuff. So it's actually funny, you look back on a lot of these and it's all very clearly seated within the domestic realm and sort of revolving around the mother and this child who's always sort of present. And the dad kind of comes in and out. But so it morphs into this strip. And I think it's such an interesting generational sort of conflict, right? Like you have the mother and the daughter. The daughter we're supposed to assume is like 6 years old or something, but she's the sort of precocious questioning child. And, digging into the sort of socio-historical data, what you find is that this sort of emblem of domestic femininity is really, really important at the sort of mid-century mark in Argentina, right? Like Argentina has gone through this process of national industrialization in the 30s and 40s, and so a lot of women are going back to work. There's women working outside of the home in ways that they hadn't before. And it created just a tremendous amount of backlash, right? And so pretty quickly they're launched this sort of campaign to like put women back in their place, right, in the home. And so this is happening on the level of just social or cultural sort of products like television and radio and magazines, women's magazines and stuff like that. But it also starts to happen really sort of intensely at the political level, right? Like this becomes like presidential campaign material, talking about the importance of like Argentine housewives to the national project. So it gets pretty intense. And of course that all gets reinforced by the sort of, television becomes sort of new right around this time. And so then, you have these sort of like classic shows that really celebrate the domestic femininity and stuff like that, reinforcing all of this. And so I think that this is such an example, an interesting example of the ways in which comics kind of serve as the space of resistance, right? And it does it in a way that sort of pokes fun. It's not like it doesn't necessarily hit you over the head with it. And you have to remember that this is being published in daily newspapers and just read by all sorts of people. But essentially, the mother plays this sort of angel in the house, domestic figure who's, um, on the surface very content and whatever, but also struggles with some of the stresses of domesticity and family life and whatever. And then you have Mafalda, who's really questioning it the whole time. And so there becomes this sort of generational struggle, and Mafalda trying to figure out who she wants to be and realizing that it's not her mother, right? So which causes some tension. And it's just a really interesting strip in terms of the younger generation questioning, the previous generation and finding new sort of paths and finding new ways to become a woman in the case of Mafalda, right?
And do you think it was able to kind of slip under the radar with these, dramatic, actually extremely radical kind of messages because it was a strip and because it had Mafalda as the protagonist?
I think so. I don't think that if you had, like, if there was like a real radical, like 17-year-old who was like shaking her mother down over breakfast, I don't know that it would be read the same way. But, there's this sort of, we allow in many ways children to do and say things that adults can't, right? There's this idea that children are sort of innocent and they're exploring and they don't understand, right? Which I also don't think is true. I mean, I think that this is one of the constructions of childhood that we have sort of bought into. And I think that this pushes up against that too, this sort of model of childhood innocence of saying like, no, actually children understand a lot of things that are happening. And they're actually have a lot of knowledge and ability, right? But yeah, I think that it gets away with the sort of critiques it makes because it uses a child as the sort of voice box for them.
Speaking of which, and now we're finally moving back up toward the border. In La Familia Burron, you also do some really amazing kind of work, analytical work, and maybe you can talk about also its subversive aspects.
Yeah. I mean, you look over here on the, I guess I have to think about the flipping of the screen but you have this image of Bola over here as sort of like a revolutionary, right? She's got the balas and she's got she's got her gun, she's got her hat on. Like, this is a fun family comic in a lot of ways. And it also does a lot, in some ways it serves almost as a sort of primer for people who are increasingly flocking to the cities from rural areas. I mean, this is a really important part of comic books in Latin America around this time. This is I think it's first published in 1938. I'd have to look back, but this is when you have this really rapid sort of expansion taking place, massive migration from this is where I start thinking, the campo a la ciudad, like you have people moving from like the countryside into the city and into these, vecindarios. And it really explores what it means to be a part of society and part of a neighborhood and part of a sort of a family and what all these roles look like. But it really focuses in on the wife and mother of this family, Bola, right? And she's constantly trying to sort of get out. Like, the basic narrative structure of this is that she is, I think she comes from a wealthy family, but she married like a barber and, she loves him very much, but like, dang, she wants some more money. So like, she's always kind of hustling a little bit to try to make some more money. And what's interesting about all of her schemes is that they always take her outside of the domestic realm, right? Like, she's always trying to get outside of the house and do something else. And, the goal is to make money, but also it's to get her out of the house, and her husband's kind of like giving her, giving her flack about like not keeping a super clean house and like abandoning her children or whatever. And she's just off kind of doing what she wants to do. You know, there's some limitations here that I talk about in this article a little bit. Like, even if she always manages to get out of the domestic sphere, she always ends up back in it, right? Like, there's this really sort of circular logic. But I think that that's also in some ways sort of true of that time, right? That a lot of times women trying to get out of these sort of domestic roles kind of end up being forced back into it. So there's this really interesting critique. And then this, you know, this comic goes on sort of forever. I think it ended up being published until 2008 or something like that. So, you know, it changes and evolves over time. But I really think that particularly the early issues of this are so interesting, and there's just so much there. And the fact that she's such a celebrated, like, she's really like a badass character. And I just think that it's a really great example of a super empowering representation of womanhood at this early time, even if it's sort of limited in some ways.
Mm-hmm. So amazing, so great. You also teach a number of courses on comics, which is so cool. Latin Latinx American comics, comics in the Hispanic world, Hispanic comics in translation, international feminist comics. Can you share some of your methods for teaching comics?
Yeah, I can share a couple. I mean, you know, for one thing, I think that one of the most important things for me is to get students to really focus on form, right? So that means learning to talk about how reading comics is different, but also to get students to really not just sort of hang on to the plot, right? Which is something that we do a lot when we read prose or even poetry, right? Like, there tends to be a lot of there's just a lot of emphasis on what's happening, and I want students to get a better idea of how that's happening visually in the text too. So I actually I like to start off with silent comics, just to sort of break down what is happening visually and to get students to actually read frame by frame using only images. I've done this with animation in the past too, particularly in the like LatinX American comics classes, which I teach in Spanish. But one text I really like to use, it comes from that trilogy. It's the like Love trilogy with all the animals. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a series by Frederic Premaud and Federico Bertolucci. And there's one called the Fox, which is just like tremendous, and it's gorgeous. And I like to read that with students and talk about how the narrative gets built without using any words. And then I think that it helps them kind of, you know, focus on that even when there is dialogue and stuff like that. I do some drawing exercises and comics jams and stuff like that in my classes too. I like to have students do sort of the Linda Berry inspired attendance cards, spending the first couple minutes drawing attendance cards on a theme every day. And I'm teaching a feminist comics class over the winterim this year. Online, you know, all this online teaching now. And I'm actually going to, for the first time, I'm sort of embarrassed to say that I haven't done this before, but, you know, I've been looking more at all the things on like Nick Susanis's website. He has so many great like things for teachers. And I've looked at them before, and I've done some, you know, sort of modified things, but I'm going to try doing the visual annotations for the first time, where students have to actually trace like either a panel or a strip or a page, and then like actually go in and like annotate all the things that are like happening there. So I'm going to try that out. I'm really excited to get them to focus like in that sort of way on the page.
Are your students, I'm constantly surprised at, the fact that many of my students, they're kind of, maybe one or two read comics, but the majority know comics through like the MCU and stuff. How about your students?
Most of I typically, maybe I have one student in a class who has like read some comics. I think that when I've had comics readers in my classes before, they tend to be either manga readers or sort of like Marvel kind of stuff. So it's one thing I really like about teaching comics, that I'm able to introduce students. And so then, a lot of times you end up with students who get really, really excited about like Linda Berry or Emil Ferris or whatever, and then go on these like huge benders and like read all the comics over winter break or whatever. So it's great. I really like having real sort of beginners in the class.
Yeah, I love it too. I'm teaching my Intro to Comic Studies course right now, and they're all beginners.
So
And
great.
so you're also, of the many hats that you wear, academic director of the International Comics Forum, and I believe second vice president of Comic Studies Society. Why are these for you? These forums, these comic studies forums and societies, important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, these were some of the most like foundational experiences as a young academic, right? Going to conferences like ICAF. CSS didn't exist at the time, and I'm so glad that it does now, because it's such a tremendous resource for up and coming and established comic scholars. But I mean, I guess I just think that mentorship is so important. Creating sort of professional opportunities for junior faculty, contingent faculty. I mean, this, like, you are one of the biggest signal boosters I know. Like, it's so important to create opportunities for people. I feel like there was a lot that were created for me in these kinds of spaces and then in publishing. And I just, this is my way of sort of paying it forward, I guess, a little bit. I really like being a resource for other people that are, particularly those that are new to the field.
Yeah, no, you're right. So important, because, well, I mean, whether you're in language, modern languages, sort of literature, English literature departments, art history departments, even,
Yeah.
Comics isn't really like on the books, right? So we need these other spaces that we actively kind of shape and create, so that new gens find their confidence, find their voices, and of course, keep people like me on our toes as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, taking a step back and all of the amazing things that you do, where is the vitality in comics and comic studies today for you?
Yeah. This is a hard question. But I think that, as in most things, it's in the next generation of creators and scholars and thinkers, right? I mean, it's the sort of people that are, the graduate students that are giving talks at ICAF and CSS and who are publishing. There was just actually that issue of prose studies that just came out. I was really pleased to see, and I won't remember the title. You might have to help me with that. It was something like, do you remember the title of that?
Putting the non-prose fiction back into Latinx studies.
Yeah,
Was
yeah,
this?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I ended up having to like get every single article through Interlibrary alone, because you're like, wait, that's a whole journal, and I was like, yes, I want to read the whole thing. But I was so excited to see, as always, like, it always makes me happy to see when graduate students are being published and stuff, and the work in there is so good, and like, there's really great stuff being done, and yeah, that's where it is. You know what I mean? I just really believe that that's where it is. And And, it's my job and your job to sort of support that and foster that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was so excited with Maite's piece and Stacy Alex's piece.
Yeah.
And kind of without knowing it, they were kind of coming at, the work of Eric Garcia and Alberto Ledesma, and of course Lalo's work. So yeah, it was really, really, oh gosh, yeah, so exciting to have that in the special issue. And I'm totally with you on that. So what are you working on? What's next?
Ooh, so I'm going to be working on a monograph. I have sabbatical in the spring, which I'm very excited about. Thank you, St. Ambrose. And yeah, so it is tentatively titled Graphic Narratives of Resistance. It's, of course, focuses on Latinx American comics. And I'm really just exploring the ways in which comics have served as this sort of site of resistance throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. So as in almost all of my work, I'm looking at US Latinx titles in conjunction with Latin American titles. I've been really inspired. I was sort of inspired by this project by all the work I was doing on Alberto Ledesma's Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer. That is something that I've been researching and talking about for the last couple years. I almost came out with an article on that and decided I was going to keep it for the monograph because I really wanted to expand, like, who are the other creators throughout Latinx America who have been doing that same kind of work of sort of counter storytelling and resistance, using comics and sequential art as the medium for that. So I'm going to be working on that starting actually pretty soon. So I think we have like 3 more weeks of class at St. Ambrose. We're kind of on the early out thing this semester. And so I will be working on a book and staying at home and there's nothing else I can do. It's not like I can travel and stuff like that. So I will be doing lots of writing at home in my office, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Also. Yeah, I'm so excited for that book, Brittany. And of course, I'm here with my catcher's mitt ready for it. Ledesma's book, speaking of Alberto's work, Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer, that's like my biggest seller for the Latino graphics. And I think we're at something like maybe pushing 8,000 copies sold. Which is just amazing. Yeah, I love it, and I love that it's adopted as the Cal State Fullerton, I think, had it as one of their books, and really, really amazing. And I'm so glad you're working on that. Well, my goodness, comics of the Latinx Americas definitely matter. Thank you, Brittany, for joining me for this gift of your experience, your journey, your knowledge.
Thank you so much. It was really nice having this conversation.